If you look back at the course of history, the big ideas, the one that change fields of science or transform industries, rarely arrive with blaring trumpets or red carpets, dazzling everybody with their brilliance. They're usually dismissed or neglected for years, sometimes even decades, and their champions are written off as crazy. There wasn't any good word in the English language to capture that, so I made one up.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, why do good teams kill great ideas?
Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a great pleasure to introduce our extraordinary two speakers today.
Don't you miss that? Not the applause, though that's nice too. I mean the ambiance. Live events, indoors and in person, silencing your phone, squeezing into a folding chair, wishing you'd topped up your plastic cup of wine before they turned down the lights. In the before times, we held events every month at the Next Big Idea Club headquarters. And lately, I've been scrolling through the Next Big Idea app and reliving a few of my favorites, like this one, a conversation between our curator, Daniel Pink, and physicist turned biotech entrepreneur, Safi Bahcall. In my introduction to the event, I shared with the crowd the very personal effect Dan's book, When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing, had on my life. It's a book in which Dan devotes many hair-raising pages to the correlation between the afternoon slump and medical malpractice.
2 months ago, I had a colonoscopy scheduled. I called up and I canceled it. It was scheduled for the afternoon, and I rescheduled it for the morning. I'm not going to go into all the rest of the things you can learn from When, but I will also say you should definitely go. If you plan to ever get surgery in the balance of your life, definitely go out and buy When and read When.
Next, I introduce Safi.
Safi Bahcall is an extraordinary person. I had the great pleasure of speaking with his mother earlier this evening. If you are the son of a legendary astrophysicist and a legendary theoretical physicist, what do you do?
It's obvious, isn't it? You graduate summa cum laude from Harvard, get a PhD in physics at Stanford, and then you say, well, maybe I need to do something different. So you take a job advising companies at McKinsey, which, of course, inspires you to start a company of your own, a revolutionary biotech firm aiming to cure cancer. And then, to cap it off, you write a book about the intersection of physics, history, and business. It's called Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. One person described it as the Da Vinci Code meets Freakonomics. It's a brilliant book about how you could use the simple laws of physics to provoke creative breakthroughs. And it's a wonderful treat to listen to Safi's conversation with Dan. Maybe even do what I did, close your eyes and pretend that once again you're sitting shoulder to shoulder with a bunch of strangers learning something new.
I think you're all going to really enjoy the conversation tonight. So with no further ado, Dan Pink and Safi Bahcall.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, I'm Dan. That's Safi. We split the 2-for-1 deal at Men's Warehouse. So,
I lost.
So can you guys all hear me in the back of the cheap seats? Yeah. So it's great to be here. Thank you for all of you who have supported the Next Big Idea Club. Just to echo what Rufus said, we do have this world where you feel like the culture has coarsened, where people don't have conversations, they just scream at each other, where people aren't actually concerned about ideas, but they're concerned merely about confirming their own existing biases. And in some ways, in many ways, Next Big Idea Club is just a direct, I think very potent antidote to that. And I think it's one reason why it's grown so fast. So it's really, it's a delight to be part of it. And the main reason it's a delight to be part of it is that you get an early look at some extraordinary books, including the book we're going to talk about tonight. It is called Loonshots. It's written by this guy. Now, I always think it's interesting to start with people's backstory because Rufus gave us a hint, Safi, but where did you grow up?
I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey.
Princeton, the mean streets of Princeton, New Jersey. Yes.
Gang. It was a very rough gang.
Yeah. So tell us about your mother and your father, and if you can, what's it like growing up with two parents who are physicists? I recognize your mother is here, so be polite. Right.
I should just stop by saying that every now and then when I get these kind of glorifying introductions, I say, gosh, I wish my mother was in the audience. You are. Yeah. I hope you believe even 10% of that stuff. So, also, I actually should say, it may be the first time I've ever been introduced, preceded by a story on colonoscopy. So thanks. Thanks for that, Rufus. Planting that visual, which will no longer extend to both of us. What was it like growing up?
Well, wait, seriously, this is a serious question because like you came to write this book at, how old were you when you wrote this book?
12, 13?
Yeah.
No. In my late 40s.
Yeah, so you have a whole history of your life until you got there. So let's I want to hear a little bit about it. So what were you like as a kid?
Here we go.
What were you interested in?
No, I think it sounds dramatic and glorious to have two astrophysicist parents, but a lot of the time it's like, well, what's for dinner? Is it pizza or Hoagie Haven, or who's gonna fix the VCR for those people who remember what that was? But I think what it did, and the benefit and the excitement of that is we had a family of asking questions. So when you're a scientist, you really focus on asking interesting questions, and that stayed with me my whole life, and that kind of drove a lot of things in my life and changes that I made in my life, and how I think about what I want to do next is curiosity.
And so did you have to come to the dinner table armed with a question?
Mom? Is that right? No, it wasn't like that, but it was just, you see that around you. They're always like, oh, here's something in the world. Like when you're...
Did you have, I don't want to turn this into a therapy session, Safi, but I want you to be a little bit more
Sounds
forthcoming
like
here.
One.
Did you have a sense of what your parents did, like when you were a kid? Did you know what physicists did?
No clue. No,
Yeah.
but I'd be driving along with my dad in the down a street, and you'd see this sort of shimmering thing that looks like a lake. If you're ever driving on the asphalt, and instead of just ignoring it, you'd be like, well, why do you think that's shimmering? Why does it look like a lake? And then we talk about refraction, and that just creates, I'm sure that happened to all of you guys with all of your dads.
That's cool, but I think that's interesting, right? But you ended up studying physics in college.
I did, and part of that curiosity thing is that you see stuff in the world, like why is the sky blue? That's sort of a classic or cliche, but you start looking around. Why is water wet? You just start asking why the world is the way that it is, and you just keep going.
And so you went even further with physics to get a PhD. Yep. And what was the impetus behind that? Just like more questions?
Yeah, it's just, you're just teasing. In undergraduate science, you're just learning some of the basics, sort of the basic rules, the basic language. It's sort of like writing. You learn some of the basic techniques of writing, but that's very different than producing a book.
Sure.
So you go to graduate school, you learn, okay, I'm done with all the elementary rules.
Right.
Now how do we figure out something new about the world? And that was really exciting.
Interesting. But you chose not to pursue that path as a scholar.
Yeah, I don't think I'd set foot off a university until I was 29 or 30. And then I just started to get really curious because I observed something about the world, and this may shock you, but not all people are physicists or mathematicians. And in fact, a large majority of people are not actually physicists or mathematicians. And I was like, what do they do for a living? I was just very curious, what do people who are not physicists, they get up in the morning, and then what happens? And so I just got very curious about that. And I remember I was, dating somebody at the time, and I was like, you have a real job. What is that like? Could you take me to an office building, and can I meet these people? Because I don't know what that is. And, I really didn't. And I was curious. And she was actually I don't know if I should be talking about this. No, my wife will never watch this. But she was working at a law firm as, what is it called, paralegal. So I said, oh, you take me? Okay, sure, I'll take you for, and I went around and asked everybody a little thing. Oh, do you like your job? No. Do you like your job? No. I hate it. I'm like, this just doesn't sound good. So it's like, maybe I should stay in physics a little longer. But eventually I got really curious about how the rest of the world works. What is, big companies, small companies, entrepreneurs, that makes the world go around. I was curious, how does that work?
So you went from your PhD program into McKinsey, consulting companies.
Yeah.
How long did you do that?
McKinsey's kind of like a halfway house for academics just before they let them loose in the real world.
Yeah.
You got to kind of train them and let them speak English in normal sentences and dress properly. But it was amazing that they paid you to learn. And so that's what I really enjoyed.
But then you left there and you started a company.
Yeah.
What's the impetus behind that?
Well, the motivation in academic science is the search for truth, which is kind of an exciting, ambitious, higher purpose. And in McKinsey, it was really a learning experience. Your job is to solve business world problems. So it's a halfway house because you're solving puzzles and problems, but your goal is to make successful companies more successful. And over time, I just started realizing what was really satisfying for me is if I could help other people. Around that time, my father got sick, and I realized there would be something. We lost my father eventually, and I realized there's something enormously powerful if you feel like you are working to give people and families on Earth more time with their loved ones, and that's just such a motivating force and power, and such a great reason to get up in the morning. And that's what I wanted to do, is combine science and business and help scientists who had ideas that were stuck at universities or in the lab, bring them out of the lab and turn them into products that could help people.
Which you did, starting a company that specialized in cancer drugs.
Yeah, that's right. So I spent about a year on the road just sort of talking to different scientists at different universities, and I ran into a scientist who's now emeritus, a professor at Harvard, who had a bunch of terrific ideas, and they were sort of stuck and trapped. And I decided to work with him and start this company, and we developed a portfolio of products, but mostly focused on new drugs for treating cancer.
And the company did well. You succeeded, at least in part, in your mission.
It's still going, but I left a few years ago, but we took the company public, and we had some ups and downs like every biotech company, and we'll see, jury's still out.
Yeah. Now, so let's move into books. So how did you prepare yourself for this role of starting a company? Did you read business books?
I did. When I first started my biotech company, I was in my early 30s. So I read like drinking from a fire hose. I read everything I could find about what it takes to be a great leader, a great manager. It was kind of frustrating. The first 5 or 10 books or articles about, create a great culture and do this stuff, you're like, oh yeah, that sounds good. I want people to be empowered. That's awesome. Let's do that. And then the 10th time, empower, and then the 100th time, let's empower people and celebrate. You're like, is there anything more? I want something a little harder and more satisfying. So it got a little frustrating after.
And was that the germ of your book, Loonshots, do you think? That frustration with what was out there?
I was always looking for something beyond, in business books, there's sort of the two kinds. There's the CEO biographies. Let me more or less explain to you how great I was and how dumb my competitors was. It wasn't luck. It was, I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit. That's not exactly what they say. But the second one is, we took a survey and asked successful companies and looked at unsuccessful companies, and here's the difference. That's unsatisfying. Like if you did a survey of 1,000 CEOs and looked at total return to shareholders, and the ones that were successful drank scotch and the others drank whiskey, does that mean you should drink scotch? So I just got kind of unsatisfied. I was trying to understand if there's a more scientific way, if there's something underlying all that culture stuff.
So I think that in the course of this journey sort of led to this book, because you ended up writing a book rooted in a business book, but rooted somewhat in physics. And at the core of the idea is this notion of what a loonshot. A loonshot. So how is a loonshot different from a moonshot? We have a sense of what, like companies talk about, we need a moonshot. We need some big, hairy, audacious goal. But nobody ever, until 2 weeks ago, has ever talked about loonshots. What the heck is that?
Well, if you look back at the course of history, the big ideas, the one that change that change fields of science or transform industries rarely arrive with blaring trumpets or red carpets, dazzling everybody with their brilliance. They're usually dismissed or neglected for years, sometimes even decades, and their champions are written off as crazy. There wasn't any good word in the English language to capture that, so I made one up.
Right. So give us an example of a loonshot.
Well, one example is...
Do loonshots become moonshots? Is that your...
Well, no, moonshot is a goal, is a destination. Nurturing loonshots is how we get there. So, for one example, when John F. Kennedy declared we're going to put a man on the moon, that was the original moonshot. But how do we get there? Well, it turns out 30 years earlier, a guy named Robert Goddard had suggested a crazy idea. Well, we're going to do, explode fuel inside this metal canister, and that'll go into space. And people said, you're out of your mind. People ridiculed him, like in the front, New York Times. It wasn't just for a year or 2 years, it was 30 years. And of course, that was liquid-fueled jet propulsion. And that's what ended up getting us to the moon. So Kennedy's goal, his ambition, was the original moonshot. And Goddard's idea was a classic loonshot.
Right. And so one of the arguments in your book is that many organizations don't do enough to foster those loonshots. So what should organizations be doing so that they're able to nurture these kinds of things and they're not immediately dismissed as crazy ideas?
Right. And it starts with a strange puzzle, which is if we take there's a nice audience here, and if we take any individual person and say, here's this kind of crazy, wild idea, and we talk about the merits of it, they're like, yes, let's go do it. Now you bring all of those same people together into a group and they'll reject it. Question is why? And that if I could take a break and talk about a glass of water.
Please do, because I think that's like the key. To me, that's the key metaphor. Like after reading this book, I will never look at a glass of ice water the same.
So let's take this glass of water. You can stick your finger in it and swish it around. And that's true for any liquid. The molecules just slosh around. Except as I gradually adjust the temperature, all of a sudden, they'll completely change behavior. At 32 Fahrenheit, they'll completely change behavior. They'll become totally rigid. The water will freeze into ice. Why? It's exactly the same molecules. There's no CEO molecule with a bullhorn saying, oh, let me check. Oh, it's 33. Everybody slosh around. Oh, no, wait, no, it's 31. Okay, everybody line up. No, it's back to 30. Okay, they just do it. Why? That's called a collective behavior. And so it was thinking through that and applying that to the collective behavior of people that you see that people they will suddenly transform from embracing wild new ideas to rigidly rejecting them. And it has nothing to do with the individual. Just like no individual molecule is saying, I feel liquid today, let me just run around. Or I feel rigid, I'm just going to stay in place. It's the same molecule. If you take one molecule and you drop it on a block of ice, what does it do? It freezes. One molecule, you put it in a glass of water, it sloshes around. So that's how I started to think about teams and companies, because underlying that is two forces, a tug of war between two forces. And the same kind of tug of war between two forces that you have in a glass of water, that's the structure underlying the culture, is what happens inside a company. And for too long, people have just talked about the surface, the patterns of behavior, the culture that you see. But underlying that is the structure. And structure are the underlying incentives that drive those patterns of behavior.
Right. So in some level, what you're doing is, so a lot of, along with the business books about empowerment, there's a whole shelf full of business books about culture. And there's a line, probably you might have used it even at McKinsey, where in sort of business thinking, culture eats strategy for lunch. But I think what you're saying is that structure eats culture for dinner.
That's right. Exactly right. So culture is a pattern of behavior that you see on the surface. Now, structure is what may be driving that culture. Culture is very hard to change. Structure is actually very easy to change. That's why it's so important. And I'll give you an example. Suppose you organize people into a group, and when you organize people in a group, you create two forces. Two things that tug at people. One is there's stake in outcome. Let's say you're a small biotech company and you want to develop a new cancer drug. You have an enormous stake in outcome. It works, everybody's a hero and a millionaire. It fails, everyone's unemployed. Now let's say you're at Pfizer, just to make up a name, totally at random, hypothetical company, just, for any lawyers in the room, I don't know, it's just no relation. Now you have many more people. You can't manage them like you do with 10 people with one team cap. You need layers. You need a vice president, a senior vice president, maybe an executive vice president. So now you have a second incentive, and that is perks of rank. Those two things are in conflict. And as you change structure, you change how you reward people, you'll start to favor one over the other. So, for example, if you compensate people based on rank, what are people going to do? Their motivation is going to be to fight up that ladder. And how do you fight up the ladder? Well, you stab the other guy. One thing you do is you stab the other guy. You might have some innovative idea. You might have some terrific idea. I said, that's a great idea, Dan. Then I go talk to the boss. Dan doesn't really want to say, and I didn't want to say in front of anybody else, but listen, let me tell you about all the flaws in his idea. Why? Because you want the next job up. Perks of rank become more important. So what happens is collectively everybody, I might like your idea and you might like my idea, but our incentives are perks of rank, so we shoot down our ideas. So that's the structure. If you reward rank, you're creating a political culture. If you reward people based on their nurturing of their crazy ideas, you create an innovative culture. It sounds like these are two different cultures, and they are two different cultures, but what makes it so different is the underlying structure. Culture is hard to change. Putting people in a room and playing videos and singing Kumbaya and hold hands is not very effective. I don't know if you've ever done that in a business situation, but it just doesn't work very well. But businesses keep trying to do motivational stuff like that. But changing culture is much easier. Ordering these molecules to be rigid or be fluid is the equivalent of trying to change culture.
So the idea is that in one structure of an organization, it's going to be amenable to Loonshots. In another structure, it is going to be resistant to it.
That's right.
So one of them is going to be the molecules, which will remain the same because the people remain the same. Exactly. They're going to run around and foster Loonshots, and other ones are going to sort of be rigid in place and concerned about rank. So bring this to a specific example. So give us a sense of an organization or any kind of institution that has battled this and how it came out.
And the reason that it's so exciting and kind of fun and interesting to think about this is that changing culture is like changing temperatures. Those small, you don't have to order each molecule to go do stuff. You just change the temperature and they'll all change. So for one example, what encourages a political culture? Well, if your boss is making your decisions on who gets promoted, let's say your boss has 10 direct reports and a new spot opens up to be her peer. Let's say she's a vice president and she has 10 associates and she is the one who's choosing who's going to be promoted. Well, what are those 10 associates going to be doing all year long? They're going to be, subtly fighting each other for who gets that slot. Now, suppose you do something kind of radical, which is done at Google, it is done at McKinsey, it's done at a bunch of kind of forward-thinking companies. You take those decisions away from the manager. The manager just focuses on the strategy and taking care of employees, but the promotion decisions, someone independent comes in, does an interview process, asks the manager her opinion, asks the other associates, asks clients, customers. You actually take the manager out of the equation. Then what are those 10 associates going to do? It's pointless to be lobbying her all year round. Instead, why? Because when the interview person comes in to make that call, they're just going to say that person's a dick, and they're not going to get promoted. So you don't do the lobbying, you don't do the politics. So that's just one example of how you think about structure versus culture.
Okay, so by manipulating the structure of your business, you can change the culture. What if you want to foster a culture of creativity? What if you want to build a Loonshot factory? What kind of structural changes do you need to make then? Safi has the answer right after the break.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Fields. Tune into my podcast for conversations about the sweet spot between work, meaning, and joy. And also listen to other people's questions about how to get the most out of that thing we call work. Check out Sparked wherever you enjoy podcasts.
It's a beautiful summer day in Houston, 1962, and John F. Kennedy is at Rice University's football stadium telling a crowd of 40,000 why he wants to pursue an impossible goal.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
In the end, we didn't win them all. Rice played Texas a month later, and they only managed to tie. But 6 years later, America lived up to Kennedy's bold promise.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Ever since then, we've used the word moonshot to describe audacious goals. But Safi Bahcall says that before you can achieve a moonshot, you've got to start with a loonshot. That's his made-up term for game-changing ideas that are so outlandish, they're immediately dismissed, neglected, or written off as crazy. Kennedy's confident prediction that we'd put a man on the moon was the ultimate moonshot, but the loonshot that made it possible was the widely ridiculed claim made by a scientist back in 1926 that you could power a rocket by exploding fuel inside of a metal canister. The lesson here is that you need to foster loonshots to make moonshots achievable, which begs the question, how do you do that?
What are the conditions that foster that? Like, what do leaders do to foster loonshots?
All right, so one of the most important things you need to do is separate your artists and your soldiers.
Okay, so that's a big idea in this book. So artists and soldiers. Tell us, who are the artists, who are the soldiers?
All right, so the artists are whether they are creative designers or they're scientists or they're people inventing new products. They have different motivation, different language. They want to take as much risk as possible. The soldiers are the ones that take a new idea and turn it into products that you deliver on time, on budget, on spec to customers consistently. Those are two very different jobs. Here's the reason you need to separate them. They speak different languages. Here's what I mean by that. The English word risk. Now, to a soldier, risk is a really bad thing. If you're going on a battlefield, you don't want a lot of risk. So in fact, a commander might say, you've really de-risked this battle, and that's an awesome thing. Boom. If you're manufacturing tanks or guns, you've really de-risked this process. Now imagine going to an artist and saying, wow, you've really taken all the risk out of your art. It's the opposite. So it's totally different. You don't want to tell a soldier, for an artist, you say, or a scientist or someone who's inventing something, you say, try 10 different things, 20 different things, see, which 8 of those 10 things are good. You don't tell someone who's manufacturing planes, here's what you need to do. Let's fly 10 planes into the sky and see which 8 crash. We'll keep the 2 good ones. Totally, you need to separate your artists and your soldiers, and that's kind of step one.
Now, when you say separate, do you mean physically? Tell me what the specifics are. Is it physical separation? Is it literally different offices? Is it different ways of leading those kinds of people? Give us a more specific.
It's all of the above. So if you're lucky enough to, we'll come back to what to do if you're a solo person and you can't separate yourself in space, at least not yet. But if you're a large enough company, you can create separate roles. Creating a separate building is sort of almost a cliche. That's the least the interesting things. There are 2 other things you have to get right. You have to separate your artists and soldiers, which includes creating completely different systems, because one, you want as much risk as possible. The other, you want as low risk as possible. You have to get 2 completely separate systems. But the second thing, and a lot of people do that, but the second thing, which is where most teams and companies or any kind of group fail, is in the transfer. Because The problem with real innovation, creating new ideas in teams, companies, or groups, is not the supply of new ideas. The ideas in many ways are cheap. You can have tons of ideas or a lot of creative people. If you know how to motivate them and surface good ideas, it's not that hard. Innovation fails in the transfer. So you need to manage the transfer, not the technology. And it gives you, if you're a manager or a leader, it gives you a different way of thinking about your job. Your job is not to be a Moses standing on the top of a mountain and saying, all right, I'm anointing the holy Loonshot. This is the chosen project this year. Let's part the seas and make way. All you soldiers just do what I say. That doesn't work. It's from the top. You need to manage the touch and balance between these two groups, because that's the key. No one else can be in charge of the transfer. You can. Artists are doing their job. Soldiers are doing their job. If you're a manager or a leader, your job is the transfer, and that's where most things fail. Not just one way. Get the baby ideas out, not too early, not too late, but the way back, because most ideas fail. And if you don't get the feedback from the field to the artist, it'll just die.
Give us an example of a case where either this went right or went wrong.
Well, I'm kind of a fan of World War II history, and one of the examples, one of the technologies that made an enormous difference in winning the course of World War II is radar, microwave radar. And that's because the US, the Allies, 2 or 3 or 4 years into the war, were being killed by U-boats. And this may or may not be familiar to many of you, but U-boats were strangling the Atlantic for the first few years of the war. And by the 4th year of the war, by early 1943, England was running out of oil. They had 3 months left of oil. And the U-boats were shooting down ships in the Atlantic. America was trying to resupply Europe, was shooting down ships in the Atlantic faster than the Allies could build them. And that was because of the U-boat problem. What turned the course of the war was a technology called microwave radar, which allowed planes to see. So you'd think, in the classic sort of revisionist history, as soon as the scientists invent microwave radar, you're done. Oh, great. You do a little test. There's a bunch of guys in a building in Boston. Look at Boston Harbor. We can see the U-boat. No. The first time they said we have radar, the pilots were like, I don't want a new technology, which is like all soldiers everywhere. They're familiar with their stuff. It works. They're busy. The first thing will never work. They're going to have to figure it out. They're going to have to talk to those crazy scientists who are all just a bunch of kooks, and they don't want to deal with it. So Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of that, worked with them to get the pilots to try it out, and they did. Nothing happened for almost a year. So finally, he said the problem was the transfer the other way. So he got the scientists, the crazy artists, to get in the cockpits with the pilots, and they discovered when they were flying over the Atlantic or when they were flying over battlefields, the pilots, when they were being shot at, flying hundreds of miles an hour, they didn't want to deal with the 13 switches on these crazy the boxes worked, but there were so many switches they just didn't have time to figure it out. They realized that technology was great, the user interface was lousy. They went back, identified this, created this display that you see in movies with the oscilloscope and the sweeping line, put it in the planes. Planes went out. Within 30 days, Nazi Germany lost 1/3 of their U-boat fleet. 2 months later, the German admiral sent a message to all the U-boats in the Atlantic. Withdraw. The battle has been lost. The lanes were cleared to resupply England. The lanes were cleared for an Allied invasion of Europe. So that's how managing the transfer is so important. You need to be a gardener, not a Moses.
Right. So you need to set up the Loonshots. You need to have, in a business sense, your soldiers are actually delivering the profits from franchises that you've already established. And you got to make sure that they're separated, but there's a channel of communication between them. Now, you also write about different types of Loonshots. Some of them are more about strategy. Some of them are more about products. Tell us about that and why it matters.
That matters enormously, especially today, because there are these two types of, and I'll explain what I mean by those. There's a product that everybody says will never work, whether that was the telephone where people said, it doesn't work, even if it does, it's just going to be a toy, or the transistor. You could never make a switch out of solid-state devices or personal computers or digital. Those are all products that people said could never work. Small shifts in strategy are subtle changes in how you deliver stuff to customer that have no new technology. I'll give you an example. Sam Walton, when he was a young kid and wanted to open a retail store, said, I want to do it where people are, which is big cities. So of course I'm going to open it. It turns out his wife didn't like big cities and said, you know what, Sam, honey, I'll support your dream, but I'm not going to live in a town with more than 10,000 people. So he liked being married. He also liked quail hunting. And he discovered there was one region in the country where there are these 4 states that are, meet at a point and they have 4 different quail seasons. So he said, let me go there because then I can hunt quail all year round and I'll still be married. Win-win. Bentonville, Arkansas. That's where he opened his store. No new technology. He just moved to a slightly different place, sold stuff a little bit cheaper. Boom, wiped out the entire industry. That was an S-type Loonshot, no technology. So the problem is that most people have a blind spot to one or the other. Especially today, in our culture today, we worship products. Product, all these product innovators, and we miss the subtle shifts in strategy. And I'll give you an example. How many of you remember when IBM was the dominant computer company in the world? The industry was called IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. It was so much bigger than any other computer company. And what happened to them? They're not even players in that computer business now. What happened to them? They had a blind spot. What was their blind spot? They saw themselves as a product company, and that was true for 30 or 40 or 50 years. People think the personal computer took out IBM. Not what happened. IBM was the dominant product company, and they thought, what we do is we make products and people buy our products. Hey, personal computer is another product. Let's do it. And they went all in on personal computers, and they were a little bit after Apple and a little bit after Commodore and TRS and Radio Shack. And they ate their lunch. They went to number one. They had 5 billion in sales in their first 3 years. They were the dominant personal computer company. What happened? They missed a subtle shift in strategy. They missed what customers cared about. So in the course of building this product, they said, well, everybody buys IBM brand because we're IBM. We make the best products. Here's another product. Buy this stuff. In the course of building that computer, they said, the stuff on the inside doesn't matter. Little stuff like, the operating system. Let's outsource that to, at the time, a 32-person company in Seattle called Microsoft. And the other components, the thing called a microprocessor, that also doesn't matter. What matters is the product and our brand, because that's what people want, the product. So we're going to outsource that to a little chip maker company that's kind of struggling financially in Silicon Valley called Intel. Fast forward, what they didn't realize is that customers didn't care about the brand. They just wanted to send emails to their friends. And for that, the brand of the box doesn't matter. What matters is standards, stuff like software or microprocessor. Today, the combined market value of Microsoft and Intel is well over $1.5 trillion. IBM is not even a tenth of that. So that's what happens when you miss your blind spot.
What is a lesson from the book about how to be effective as a leader in a large organization?
There are 3 things you need to do. One, you need to set, by the way, since I don't have a very good memory, I remember it visually. I remember it as an ice cube, a garden hoe, and a heart.
Okay.
Ice cube, separate your artists and your soldiers. Those are different jobs, different languages. You need different systems, ice and water. Number 2, be a gardener, not a Moses. You got to manage the transfer. Number 3 may actually be the most important in many ways, and it's not talked about as much. And it's so frustrating. People get this so wrong. And number 3, love your artists and soldiers equally. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine is at a well-known magazine and is in charge of putting out an issue every 30 days. And she was complaining to me the other day. She said, the senior management is just always in love with whoever's squeaking the loudest about the latest shiny penny innovation. Oh, there's this podcast we could do with this partnership with blah, 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 and pays no attention to the people who are doing 95% of the work of putting out a magazine every day. So how does it make those people feel? Like crap, taken for granted. And you're like, why are all these just random little squeakers getting all the attention from the CEOs? What you find is the truly great leaders have learned to balance and appreciate, because you need both. Just having an idea is getting the ball from your goal to your 5-yard line. The next 95 yards down the field is about turning that idea into a product, about delivering that product, doing it on time, doing it on budget. You need the soldiers for that. You need the artists for that. And they both have to be appreciated.
And let's go. So what about for the many folks here who are at BetaWorks, they're building a company. So they're at this very embryonic stage. What are some lessons for people with those smaller enterprises?
So if you're, and you and I are also in a sense one-person companies, when you're writers or you're an entrepreneur. So if your team or your company or you are too small to split into separate physical roles and physical places, you need to separate not by role, but by time. So here's what I mean by that. You want to just carve out a period, let's say a week. Let's say you're just 5 people or 10 people. Carve out a week, take off your execution hat, on time, on budget, rigid rules, discipline, metric. Say, we, for 1 week, are just going to be insane artists. We're going to speed dial every possible crazy idea, what's going on in the market. We're going to interview people about what's the dumbest, craziest idea you've heard in our field. We're going to interview customers, clients, ourselves, our competitors. What are the crazy, and just write them down and just think about it. And at the end, we might pick the top 3 or 4 of those to work on. But when the week is over, you take off your artist hat, you put back on your soldier, and you say, all right, back to work. Now it's time for the soldiers. We need to take the top, whatever we've decided, turn that into a product, deliver that on time and budget.
Yeah. Artist time, soldier time.
Exactly.
And then hammer time.
That was painful.
Let's go out to some questions. Who has questions for Safi about any of this we've been talking about?
We'll get to those questions right after this short break. Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z general partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts.
Who has questions for Safi about any of this we've been talking about? Yes, go ahead, please.
So there's, particularly in the investment community, there's often this phrase, patient capital, particularly around things that might have a social impact, and the absence of a sufficient patient capital. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking about Loonshots was, and even the use case of somebody inventing something 30 years and then it's sort of taking 30 years to be, I mean, our organizations, I haven't seen it, that a lot of organizations are patient enough to do the truly loonshot kind of thinking. What is envisioned as truly innovative is more window dressing.
I think you're absolutely right. Not to keep going back to World War II, but that idea that turned the course of the war radar, the usual history is, it was sort of discovered in England in the mid-1930s. Turns out 2 scientists in a lab had discovered the same principles 10 years earlier. It could have shortened the war, it could have saved a lot of lives. But what happened? They were rejected by people in this large organization, not poorly intentioned people, but they said, well, that'll never, it'll take more than 18 months to play out, so let's not do it. So fast forward, I think the better organizations have learned this lesson. I'll give you an example which, as I was doing some of the research for this book, kind of surprised me, which is Microsoft. I got to know some of the people in their research group. And when Satya Nadella took over, they did have a research group which worked on some far-out ideas. But one of the things he said, he took one of the leaders in the group and said, I think your ideas may not be crazy enough. So I want you to break off of the crazy idea group and work on the crazy ideas that are too crazy for the crazy idea groups, the crazy idea groups, the crazy squared ideas. And that's what they're doing today. So I think if the better or forward-thinking companies do this, they separate their artists, they're soldiers, in that case they're artists, and then they're really, really, really crazy artists into different groups and give them different homes and nurture them, because that's the only way you can have sustainable growth.
Other questions? Right over there.
Hi, Safi. So first of all, congratulations on the book. We bow and genuflect with awe and admiration.
You can stop. Okay, next question. I'm good.
So let me ask an unfair and somewhat unanswerable question. There is a degree
Definitely
to which
next question.
everything that one has to do a book like this is you look back at what has worked and you try to find patterns that are similar and tease out lessons and observations that can be useful to apply to the present and the future. But in a weird thought experiment way, if you were to take some of the aspects of Loonshots, which would be what do people do when they're trying to do things that haven't been done, you could potentially read your book and then distill the lesson of one should do nothing that you say other people have done in the past that's worked, because it's not entirely clear that whatever has worked in the past will continue to work in the future. How do you grapple with that in the sense of the copying of past patterns is a very soldierish thing to do? And so what do you do with that conundrum wrapped in an enigma surrounded by a mystery?
Next question? No. There are two things there. One is, I wish, if I could have one wish, it's that the phrase disruptive innovation would be cut out of the dictionary. Because I think it goes to what, if you just focus on what some guru with a PowerPoint is telling you is going to be the future and is going to transform your market, you will take your eyes off the ball of those small little changes to your main business that your competitors happen to be working on. I mean, I'll give you an example. Pan Am. So Pan Am was focused on jet engines and building bigger, faster, these crazy new things. Its competitors were working on subtle, not very glamorous things like hub and spoke, fly into a hub airport, develop a hub and spoke, become more faster turnaround times. Nothing very glamorous. But when airline deregulation hit, Pan Am was dead. It had these giant planes and high fuel costs around that time, and it was gone. Its competitors, who had been innovating around the small changes that no one said would be disruptive, actually did very well. So the first thing you want to do is you want to nurture those Loonshots to challenge belief, the crazy ones that are really out there, but without that doesn't mean that take your eyes off your ball of the main products you're working on and the small little adjustments to those main products. You have to do both. You have to nurture both of those things in order to succeed. And don't worry about market potential. So many times, when I mentioned the Sam Walton story, when he moved and started a little store, was he saying, here's what I'm going to do, I'm going to disrupt the retail industry? No, he just wanted to stay married and hunt quail. So when the scientists who first developed the transistor, they said, we're going to revolutionize electronic communication. No, the scientists who were working on that transistor were trying to build better switches, and when they first built the transistor, it was so unreliable and expensive, no one could figure out what to do with it. It was actually useless in communication. It took 5 years to figure out the first application, which was hearing aids. Couldn't put a vacuum tube in a hearing aid. So did the scientists in 1945 and 6 and 7, when they were working on this project, say, I got a great idea, boss, let's disrupt the hearing aid market? No. You nurture Loonshots to challenge beliefs, don't worry about market potential, and don't take your eyes off the ball about your main business.
Let's go to the next one. Back here, please.
So, as you were talking about the concept of separating artists and soldiers, it struck me as incredibly familiar. You're like, every single day of my life familiar, because I'm a writer, and you're both writers. And so I'm curious how that process happens in your head, because, the writing process is kind of like what you're describing, where you got to be the artist and just kind of vomit on the page, but then at some point, the soldier's got to show up and tidy it up and turn it into something recognizable, presentable. So I'm just curious if you've thought about that aspect of it and what your experience of it was.
No, it's a great question. It's wearing different hats. So when you're in creating mode, you're in artist mode, you just have to speed. Creating is about, and creativity for me is three things. It's speed, attention, and courage. You just got to speed for searching for ideas. You got to pay attention when you see a tiny little thing that doesn't fit. Oh, that's the way in. That's something. You have the courage to follow it. So that's the artist hat. When you're just trying to create some really wacky, crazy idea stuff. Then you have to take off that hat and edit. If you confuse those two things, you'll get nowhere. Because if you try to create really fast, I always think about it when I'm in my artist hat, I think about it as write FBR, write fast, bad, and wrong. Because one person got it maybe. Never mind. But I think of it like that because and I did this when I first started, is if you write a sentence and say, in 1937, and then oh wait, was that 37? Let me go on Google or Wikipedia. It might have been 35, and then it was April, and then you get curious about what happened in May. Then you're like, you've written 4 words, and now you're 57 minutes into hunting through Wikipedia and Google, and nothing happens. So it's like you're driving a car. You just need to go at high speed, and if you accelerate to 5 miles an hour and then decelerate to 2, and then accelerate up to 5, you never get faster. If you have some perfectionist, I grew up as a scientist, so you want to get facts right. So it was a very difficult effort of will to say, I'm going to write in 1935, blah, 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 blah happened, and I might be wrong. But in order to get into the flow of creating some crazy thing, you have to write as fast as possible. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about writing a sentence and then perfecting it and then writing. That's a disaster. So separating artist and soldier, it's exactly what we were just talking about. You separate in time. Whether writing is one example. If you're an actual artist, same thing. You got to make your art, but then you know what? You actually have to sell it. And if you do a crappy job on that, you're kind of going nowhere. So you need to have all these crazy ideas that you put on the page, but then you need to stop. Then before you send it out, go back carefully. And that's a totally different mode, and it's completely the opposite and counterproductive to creation. You need to separate them in time. And if you confuse that, you'll get nowhere. And that's whether you're running a company. You gotta have take time out and brainstorm. If you're just too much soldier, you're just doing the next thing. You're the rat on the treadmill. Let's do this milestone, let's do that milestone. And you know what, psychologically, it is a very stressful thing to be an entrepreneur, and you fill your calendar with these little milestones because then you feel like you're getting done. But you need to take a break. Execution, operations, get that done. Put on a different hat. If it helps you to create a different hat, it does. Thank you very much. If it helps you to wear a different hat, do it. Because you don't want to be that rat in the treadmill, just going, and then you're gone over a cliff. You want to pause, take a break, whether it's a day or a week, and just say, let's think of all the crazy ideas out there that might kill us. Seriously, from our customers, our suppliers, our partners. What could kill our investors? What could they do that would kill us? And let's just set aside all the how could we be killed? You'd rather discover that in your own room, wouldn't you, with your team members, thinking about it, than with an actual bullet to your head. So take a week, or a day, or a couple of days, and just think about that. Why? Not only might it prevent you from being killed, but you could turn it around.
Let's take 1 or 2 more before we wrap up. Yes, over here, please.
Hi, I found your third idea, which you said was very important, really refreshing, which is to treat the creatives and the artists and the soldiers equally, which I don't see very often, especially in certain industries like the media industry, the fashion industry, where the people supposedly with the big ideas are like God and they're irreplaceable, and the foot soldiers, they're considered mundane and replaceable. So how do you talk to those leaders and to address this issue by reminding them that the foot soldiers in their eyes are actually playing equally important part and deserve to treat it well? And also closely related to that is once you separate this two category of people. Even though you claim that you treat them equally, the food soldiers might consider themselves to be creative people too, and they want their ideas to be recognized. How do you fend off, the potential resentment from this camp?
All right, well, you can start with a story that in doing some of the research for this book, I'll tell this story even though it's about a very famous person that we all think we knew, because what I thought I knew about it and what I think a lot of people think is not really what happened and illustrates exactly what you're talking about. And that's the case of Steve Jobs, who was hailed as this wild product innovator, crazy art. And when he was young, in his first time at Apple, when he was in his 20s and up until he was about 30 years old, he saw himself and he kept arguing with pride, I am an artist. And when he was working on this new project called the Macintosh, he said, we're all artists and everybody else is the Navy. We're the pirates and the artists and the creatives. And you guys, literally, you guys suck. And called them bozos. And they actually, that was 95% of the company that was generating 95% of the revenue. And they took to wearing buttons with Bozo the Clown with a red line. We're not bozos. What happened? The morale was terrible. People started leaving on the franchise side, the Apple III. The people who were working on the Apple III, like Wozniak, were doing really creative things for the Apple III, and they left. And the people on the Mac side that Jobs was leading, it was such a dysfunctional, the road between those two buildings was called the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, because there was so much hostility. Just like you say, they created this, it was incredibly dysfunctional. So what happened? When the Mac launched, it was a flop. Great advertising with the Super Bowl commercial, but it overheated, it was too slow, it was not usable, and people didn't use it. It was a complete flop. And the franchises flopped. Apple was a disaster at that time. Fast forward 12 years later, Steve Jobs came back, and what happened? On the one hand, Johnny Ive, one of the legendary great product designer artists of all time. On the other hand, Tim Cook, who was called the Attila the Hun of inventory at his previous job. Kind of the ultimate artist and the ultimate soldier. And people say, oh, Jobs was this great. What he really learned, the truth behind the story is that he learned to balance his artists and soldiers equally. And who took over when Steve Jobs died? The soldier. When he was interviewed in the last year or two of his life, he told his biographer who asked him, what's your ultimate accomplishment? He said, Jobs said, I think my greatest innovation may be in how I design my organization.
Okay, Safi, one last question for you. So imagine somebody reading this book, okay? Somebody's read this book, they've turned the last page, they've turned the cover. At that moment, what do you want them, what's one thing you want them to do as a consequence of reading the book?
I hope they're going to walk away, well, firstly, entertained, but secondly, uplifted and optimistic, realizing that all these great discoveries that you hear about, whether it was Steve Jobs, who, you sort of read about, oh, he's this great product genius. Actually, he was ridiculed for almost a decade. And so many more of these incredible breakthrough discoveries. So don't give up. All the people that you read about today with revisionist histories, they were ridiculed or dismissed, not for a week, not for a month, but sometimes for years. So number one, don't give up. And number two, remember this. There are no experts at the future.
Want to hear recordings of other great events we produced at the Next Big Idea Club? Download our app. You'll find dozens of conversations conducted by our curators, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, Daniel Pink, and Malcolm Gladwell. Plus, we have 12-minute audio summaries of the best new books read to you by the authors themselves. Just search for Next Big Idea in your app store. If you like this show, please tell the artists and soldiers in your life. And if you have a chance, leave us a review and a 5-star rating if you think we've earned it. Do you have any feedback for us? I would love to hear it. You can shoot me an email at Rufus, R-U-F-U-S, at nextbigideaclub.com. Thank you, Daniel Pink and Safi Bahcall, and special thanks to Safi's mom for attending our event. This episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger. Our executive producer is Michael Kovnak. Theme music by Costa Galanopoulos. Sound design by Mike Toda. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. See you next week.